Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Outgrowing Content Types. We're here to talk about Drupal entities, those in core, those in contrib, and how to build your own. I hope you leave this session with an understanding of the work and risks involved with building your own custom entities, but feel empowered to employ them on your own sites. My name is Jim Vomero, and I'm a senior engineer at 4Kitchens. I have over 10 years experience in Drupal, and I use the framework for all my nerdy hobbies, from running calculations to homebrew beer, to planning my retro arcade projects, to teaching kids to learn how to survive the zombie apocalypse at summer camp. And if you have any questions after this presentation, please reach out to me. I'm always excited to talk shop and love to keep this conversation going. I'm a web chef at 4Kitchens. We build websites and applications for organizations that depend on large-scale or unconventional content. We work with associations, publishers, enterprise organizations in media and in higher ed, and we make big websites. So my first big question to answer is, what is an entity? And this answer changes based on who I'm talking to. And while this session is for technical decision makers, programming experience is not required. I'm kind of curious who's in the room though. So from a show of hands, who here regularly works in a back-end environment writing PHP, SQL, using Drupal APIs? Large part of the room, wonderful. Who would call themselves a site builder, building content types, views, things through a UI? A lot of folks here as well. And who here does not identify as a programmer at all? All right, that really helps change what language I use. We can be a little more technical in this talk. So this session is largely about the business needs that may require custom entities, but we're going to look at the tools to build them. With that said, an actual training on how to build custom entities and everything under the hood is an all-day training. So we will scratch the surface on the code and mostly talk about their use cases and how that impacts your data models and your applications. So that question, what is an entity? It helps to look at Drupal's history. And in Drupal 6, we had the first version that offered a database abstraction layer. With that, the storage mechanisms for content architecture is greatly matured. A D6 site would often have hundreds of modules, like an obscene number of modules, but the one that was near and dear to so many of us was CCK, the Content Construction Kit. And in this project, you were able to add fields to your different content types. Now, unlike other CMSs, CCK extended the content storage in a thoughtful and meaningful way, and this is usually why I picked Drupal for my projects. The idea of having fieldable content made everything just more available to us. It also made everything a node. So our public content like pages, blog posts, articles, landing pages, these were made as content types. But our user profiles, those might also be made as nodes. Our images, our files, our media assets would have their own content types. I even remember working on sites where the comments as fieldable entities were content types. And this created a lot of confusing problems. It was node abuse, and it became clear that Drupal needed to rethink this content model. So come Drupal 7, there we go. Come Drupal 7, we tried to clean up these issues, and Drupal created a standard generic class for storing data, and now not everything needed to be a node. We had a new word called entities, and this term was intentionally abstract, rather generic even, and I had to look up the definition from Drupal.org. In Drupal, these are objects used for persistent storage of content and configuration information. So in D7, this was nodes, users, taxonomies, comments. All of these things became natively fieldable. And the ability to build data types that fit your organization became a driving use case to pick Drupal as your CMS. Now in Drupal 8, entities are specifically typed. So we have a number of interfaces to help us. Entity owner interface, revision log interface, entity published interface, among others. These are common interfaces that allow consistent implementation of all the features that we may want to include on our content. Now, not all content needs to be revisionable or translatable, but we just don't need to include those interfaces on our custom entities. It's also important to notice that when I'm talking about the entity API, there are two types of entities. It forks pretty quick: content entities and configuration entities. And while they're both useful in the context of this conversation, I'm going to focus on content entities, and configuration entities is something that has a lot of other fun topics as well. So we talked about entities. How are they used right now in core and contrib? To be honest, most sites I build, these default entities that I use, a few contrib, the ones in core are strong enough to build any site that I want to create. And most of my Drupal projects are going to be accomplished with just a handful of these. Looking at some of the common examples, content types via the node module are for traditional content, or pages, or things that are like pages that have a URL, blog post. Users define configurations for accounts. Files and media are stored in a media association. Oh, this is also a good time to explain a nice vocabulary word here, bundle, if you're unfamiliar with it. Bundles are a way of reusing an entity, but also giving it specific settings. So a user, for example, does not have bundles. A user is a user. If you add a field to a user, that field appears for all types of users. But content types are bundles of nodes. So some properties are true for nodes. Every node has a title, an author, a date, the promotion field, but each content type can also have its own fields, its own settings. So that's the case of bundles, and you'll see that creep up a lot when we're looking at examples. It's also important to look at popular contrib modules. These are ones that I use on many of our sites, and if you're new to Drupal, definitely explore these modules. Paragraphs are our main tool for mapping data to design components. Web forms is interesting because it's actually 3 entity types. There's the web forms themselves, the web form options, and then submissions are unique. So 3 different types of entities because they have unique storage and configuration. Good old definition of it. Groups is another great one to look at, especially if you want to learn more about how entities work. The group module has 2 types of entities, the groups themselves, which are associations of content, and then the relationships between groups and external entities. 2 different use cases in the same module. So if you're trying to learn more about the Entity API, these are very mature contrib modules to take a look at the vast ways you can tweak this Entity API to do what you want it to do. But I'm mostly here to talk about custom entities. So between core and contrib, there's a lot of tools that are disposable, a lot of tools at our disposal. So why would you even want to create a custom entity? It's usually not out of necessity. We can use nodes. We can customize these existing entities to fit most of our purposes. But there's still a few solid reasons I found that you want to make that jump and create a custom entity. And I prepared 8 examples to show potential reasons why you would want to go down this path. I would suggest if you're thinking of a custom entity on a future project, you have more than just one reason to do it. So I'm going to show some examples. You probably want to have several of these to make that business case. And my first one, custom entities can reduce overhead. This is my go-to use case. When content types are just too big for the job, and actually consider the story, as a publisher, I want to add reusable callouts and cards in the ancillary regions of my site. So I have 3 different examples on here, and they're very similar. They are all things that are displayed in part of the page, probably not main content. They all have an image. They all have a link, although the link is different. On the left, it's a button. On the middle one, there is a link as a traditional HTML link field without any kind of special treatment. And the third one, the entire card itself is a link. And to be even more, show even more differences, they have different levels of content. Some have more text than others. So they are similar, they are different, and on most sites I could probably say this is a paragraph. But let's make the assumption that we need a reusable component library. So these need to exist outside the context of a page. We need to have a library of these ancillary items and ingest them. I may be able to create these as a node, but we're going to have some problems there too, in that we then get all of the features of a node. So if each one of these is a content type, we're going to have to deal with the fact that they have a public URL, default search and indexing rules, metadata rules, content workflow. There's a number of base fields that don't matter to us, maybe the promotions, the sticky at the top of lists. In the end, making these as nodes would take a lot of time to invest to make them less node-like. So it may be a great use case for building a custom entity. And I would like to mention a great project, Rabbit Hole. So if you found yourself and you do want to use nodes for these, Rabbit Hole is a great way to turn off some of those features you don't want. But if you were building this from the ground up, you could just decide not to include those services and those interfaces and build just the entity features that you want on your custom entity. A second example of where a node is just too big for the job. I mentioned I brew beer, and I've been experimenting with my Raspberry Pi to take temperature readings. So there's a data feed that comes in, and it gives me 3 things: a temperature at a specific time, and I need to track that to a recipe ID. Those are the only 3 pieces of data I'm interested in. It comes in once a minute across a data feed, and I want to store that data into Drupal. Now I can put that on a custom table. That's not hard at all. That's pretty. I have a technical crowd here. You can make a custom data table. But we then don't get any of the Drupal features out of the box. By using entities, we're going to get very pluggable ways to introduce this data into views, to use existing render structures, to query against it using our different APIs. So I really do want to have this as a custom entity. I can make this a node, but that would be complete overkill. I don't need the add form, the edit form, the delete form. All this is coming through an API. I don't need the site-wide hooks to fire every time a new data point is added. I don't need revisioning. I don't need translation. I really just am interested in the storage of the data. So in this example, creating a custom entity allows me to find a simple data model and let Drupal do the work of storing and retrieving the data for me. And I can just leave all of the other features turned off for this custom entity. Reason number 2, kind of the opposite, when content types are too small. So for this example, I want to consider a nonprofit. And this nonprofit has locations across the world. And each one of their metros, they want to have a custom homepage for their local staff. So every location is going to have a contact page, a staff profile directory, a mission statement about the local community. Every location will also have a list of services, but the services may differ by location. And some locations are going to be real go-getters. They want a custom blog. Of course they do. So we're going to give them the ability to have a custom blog just on a few of them. I could create this with the groups module. I mentioned it. I'm a fan. And a series of nodes that relate to it. There's a lot of power in that. But I do find that when I use those types of technologies for something that's very specific, each one of these locations needs a consistent navigation, a consistent level of control of what can and cannot be a part of that site. I find myself writing a ton of validation hooks, altering a lot of the forms per content type, and really just overriding the default editorial workflows to force content that is standalone. Nodes exist on their own. Take that standalone content and force it into a model that's our business requirements. So taking a node, forcing it to be something it's not. So instead, I consider this a great use case for a custom entity when you are able to build your editorial experience from the ground up and decide that instead, I would like my own forms, I would like my own storage, and in this case, I would recommend a model where we use an overloaded table. So the entity itself stores a lot of data about this location, and just a handful of custom controllers generate the URLs to see the different pages. So here's the About Us page, here's the Services page. All the business logic is stored on the entity. It's more about configuration than it is about content at this point. What I love about that model is it creates a single place to store your business logic, and you can do it in a way that it is programmed to meet your needs, rather than turning off features in Node or brute forcing it to say, this page can only ever be in front of that page. And I recently did this with in higher ed space with a program. So students went to enroll in a degree. The university had hundreds of degrees. Every degree has faculty costs, has an application process. But some of the degrees had other information, a frequently asked questions section, something about taking exams for entrance to major. And so to be able to have a common data model for all of these was a great use case for a custom entity. Reason 3, customizing the presentation, and I kind of alluded to this, of these data elements and the forms. So I run summer camps in the Philadelphia area, and my staff submits time cards. Time cards have a lot of fields, but not all of them are visible to all of our users at once. So our camp counselors can submit their hours, they can submit their mileage, and they can see quite a few of the fields. They can add content, but they can't edit it. And so they submit their hours, and they watch it move through the workflow until it's approved. After submitting, a camp director will review the time cards. They can't change the hours, though. They can set some other values, how much the staff has earned. They can also give some bonuses, because sometimes we have hot days and miserable campers, and they've earned it. Or maybe they have some receipts for reimbursement that we're going to attach to that time card as well. So our camp director can add some values, not edit the original ones, but they can reject the time card and have the original person now re-edit their information if maybe there was a typo and they worked 18 hours that day instead of 8, or vice versa. So after the camp director approves the time cards, our finance team makes any adjustments. The finance director can edit any of the time card values, but if the value is edited, it is logged to a very transparent space, because we don't want to lose any of that data, especially financial data. And actually, none of these time cards can ever be deleted. I don't want any user, not user 1, to be able to delete a time card. This is important financial data, and I want to respect the integrity of that. So we are now in a space where I have a lot of forms in Drupal that I don't want. Or if I did use them, I would have to edit them heavily per role and per the state of the content. So this is a custom entity for me all the way. Making this custom entity allows me full control of the form. In this case, I'm actually using separate forms, completely different separate node edit forms is the analogy, entity edit forms. I'm also disabling the deleting of timesheets completely. So great use case for me, being able to customize that. And along with that, I think this is another great example in case number 4, allowing unique access controls and permissions. This is very similar. A few years ago, I created a ticketing system for a support team. Now, tickets came in multiple ways. A person might be at a help desk and meet someone face-to-face. A call or an email may come in, or someone can submit a ticket online. So since a person's submitting a ticket online, that's our internal customers. They are logging in through a single sign-on account, and they're able to add tickets. And they're able to edit some of the fields, but not all of them. Likewise, the help desk staff needs to be able to edit many of those fields and then assign those tickets to one of the support teams. For this organization, there were different support teams, one for training, one for equipment requests, another for errors on hardware, another for software issues and purchasing. So each one of these teams would get a request, and at this point, our custom entity went through a different workflow based on their taxonomy. In fact, depending on what team you are on, you may or may not have permissions to edit another team's tickets. So in general, you can edit your own tickets, not another team's. And also, you lost permission to edit a ticket once it was resolved. You had to be reopened by someone who had a higher level of permissions. This created some really complicated workflows where the tagging of the ticket and the workflow state were very dynamically changing the permissions of each member of the team. And to do this with a node was becoming a nightmare. So it was a great use case for a custom entity in that we were able to define the access control handlers from the ground up. We were not disabling what Drupal wanted to do out of the box. We were telling, here is the default behavior for create, edit, delete all of our content. Reason number 5, reusing content fields through definitions. This is relevant to here today. I've made a conference website. So in the case of a conference website, we have a series of events, maybe a session, a keynote, a workshop, social, the BOFs, and each one of the events have common things going on that we're going to present to the user. A title for the event, a location like a room number or a physical address, a time slot of when that event might be happening or a range of times, a description that will appear on the agenda if someone clicks through more. There's also things that make each one of these types of content different. So in the example of a workshop and a social, there's registration required. Or in the example of the BOF, there's probably not time to surface these on an agenda and pick a curated image. They're more fluid. They might just happen organically over the course of the conference. So we're not going to require an image. Or for the keynote, we need some higher level marketing collateral. And so we have a banner image associated with it. The fact that each one of these has its own fields, we could easily recreate as content types. And I've done that in the past, where each one of these is a content type. And for each one of those, I add the same fields. Title field probably came out of the box, but I add a location field to each one of them, a time slot field to each one of them, a description to each one of them. I also then have to manage the displays for all of those, both their preview teaser display, how they're going to appear maybe in a list of upcoming events, and then their full node display. And in a lot of cases, it's the same settings for all of these widgets across all the displays of these 5, in this case, content types. So I'd like to make a case for making this a custom entity as well. As a custom entity, I mentioned bundles before, we can create an entity that's bundleable. So each bundle, by default, will have a title, a location, a time slot, and a description. Those fields are non-negotiable. They have a standard set of displays. We can either enforce that as a requirement, displays always show a certain way, or we can set it as a default. What I love about this model is, let's say we have a 6th activity that pops up, and it's called networking. I don't know. I'm making it up. And the networking is going to use all of those fields, plus a few others where you need to sign up. Once I click the Add New Bundle button, I'm going to automatically get all of the fields that are required for an activity. I'm going to get all the properties and settings that are set by default, because those are inherent to my custom entity. It also means that when I want to change something, such as the storage of the registration, maybe we're using a third-party API, I make that change in one location for one field, and it's going to apply to any of the places I use this custom entity. So another great use case. Reason number 6, when performance is a highly valued goal. So this should be pretty familiar. We have a technical audience here in the room. In Drupal's database, when we're creating things with content types, I keep picking on content types because they got the most abuse over the years. We have a node table and a node field data table that's going to store our live content. We're also going to have mirrored copies of this information in a revisions table for past revisions of this standard feature out of the box. And in this example, I'm creating a weather content type. So imagine a temperature reading gets taken for the day. There's a high temperature, a low temperature, and a location. Do I have location? Oh, a time that temperature was recorded. So 2 temperatures and a time. Each one of those will have that will be 6 fields in total because they'll have a revision as well. So that's 10 fields in front of you. There's actually or tables in front of you. There's probably some more because there's an author field that's going to join on the users table. What this means is if I am creating a reporting database and I want to query a lot of this information, there's a number of features and settings that I just don't need access to in this storage model. This is overkill for me. And truthfully, it's what I love about Drupal, that it does all this work for me. I don't want to reinvent the wheel in how I store information, except when it's a true goal of the project I'm working on. So in this case, let's see if we can make something a little simpler. And here is our custom weather entity. In the custom weather entity, we use base fields to define just the 3 fields I need, low temp, high temp, and record time onto our custom entity. I'm not using revisions. I'm not using any of the extra interfaces other than storage in this case. So the data is stored in a single table. And for those of you that have spent some time in the database world, this is just an example of denormalizing a database. And I have some of the examples here on the screen of why you would do it. Query performance is certainly one of them. Assuming that this is recording a lot of data over time, and we need to query this for reports that are maybe time-sensitive queries. I hate to use the word real-time because it means something different in reality, but it's a good buzzword for marketing. So real-time results, this query performance, this model might help your performance against it, especially in being able to generate reports or to have an accelerated schedule of reporting. I should mention, rarely is this important for the sites I work on, because almost everything I have is behind layers and layers of caching, and that's okay. My requests don't go back to origin. But when it does matter, building a custom entity will allow you to tweak your performance to that level. I've been trying to benchmark this, so stay tuned for 4 Kitchen's blog, because when I have some good results, I'd love to see what this looks like for a great data set. But what I found, actually, is there are so many other things that are messing with my reporting. And one of the first ones I noticed was node access rules. So when you get into things like custom field access permissions, that was slowing down all of my node queries, regardless of which fields I had some of these rules applied to. So another maybe great use case for a custom entity is if you have those custom permissions, you are siloing that overhead that comes with custom access rules just to the content that matters. You're not bogging down all of your content types. It's a little wish-washy of when and how it affects the queries, but in views it was a real problem. And my last reason for non-standard storage of node data, this would be my last case for having a custom entity. And nearly all of our tables in Drupal, at least the sites I'm working on, are in SQL storage. There are a few that use no storage as the model, but Drupal 8 is built database agnostic. So it shouldn't matter if the data is stored in Drupal's database, in an external database, or in something completely different. So I'm recommending this module, external entities, if this is something that's interesting to you. I haven't had a reason to store my data outside of Drupal, especially in a very abstract way. But I think in this screenshot, or at least on the presentation on the project page, they were showing using Wikipedia as a data source. And Drupal was treating its content as if it was internal content, but it was actually coming from an external feed. So it's a fun topic of rewriting your storage handlers to surface data in a different, meaningful way. So I hope you're feeling excited. I hope you're feeling empowered. I hope you're ready to create some custom entities. And with that, warning, because you can get yourself in so much trouble. So let me just give you a couple of cautionary notes. First, there is a steep learning curve to the entity API compared to other parts of Drupal. There's just less examples to go through. I have learned most of my work on entities by looking at existing core and core and contrib entities in the Drupal space. There is a lot of documentation. You'll figure it out. I can tell it's a smart audience, but it's a word of warning. Second, you are less likely to have a contrib module work with your custom entity in the future. This actually scared me a lot more years ago when Drupal 8 was first starting and a lot of modules being ported over were node clone, node queue, node revision. So there were these modules that were specific to node that have since become more abstracted out to the entity API. And we're seeing entity clone, entity queries, everything's moving into that entity space. But you still run that risk. When you build a custom entity, you don't know that that contrib module will work with your data, but you know it's been tested against nodes. So keep it in mind. The second point, or third point, is custom entities may not inherit future Drupal features. It's another word of caution that I think in Drupal 8.4, 8.5, we saw some improvements to the node editing interfaces. In fact, we saw a lot of node features move to the entity level, so taxonomy and other types of entities can leverage them. My custom entities didn't get any of those benefits. I had to manually know to update the interfaces that were behind my entity objects. So it's actually leading towards example 4, or reason 4. You're now responsible for maintaining this custom code, so there's plenty of opportunity for technical debt. So I hope I scared you just enough that you are not going to jump on this on production, but not enough that you don't want to still see some good code examples. So let's take a peek. I think I have, 2 examples here. The first is using a module called ECK, the Entity Construction Kit, and then we'll look at Drupal console can generate entities, and that's just another great automation tool. So here is a out-of-the-box Drupal site. Drupal 8 just built it. We use Lando, in case anyone's interested. You'll see that through the demo. And the only thing I've enabled is the ECK module. I have not set anything else up regarding ECK. This is going to build in the structure menu, ECK entity types. There are 2 ways to really get into ECK. The first is using it in this context. It's going to use the same fieldable API that you use in very similar interfaces to not only create, as we would, bundles, like a content type, but to create entities themselves, and then create the bundles with those. So as an example, you might have saw some of my examples earlier, had some puns on them. That's important for me to annoy my coworkers with bad jokes. So we're going to create a joke content type, and it will include a title field. These are the available base fields. We had talked about the ones that exist for all of your bundles. But I'm going to keep it very lean. I don't care who the author is, and I'm not even going to, for whatever reason, I'm not going to create the other fields. The history doesn't matter to me on this site. So I've created a new entity type. Voila. What's important to note about ECK and using it in this context, the UI side, is that it has made some assumptions, and some fairly safe ones, of how your entities are going to work. So when I went through all of the examples, I think I had 6 different use cases for custom entities. Some of them will not apply to ECK here, because it is going to make assumptions on how you want your data stored, your access and permission handlers. It's going to look at the different routes that are available to your content, and just make a decision of how you want to implement that. With that said, there is a growing amount of developer tools to extend and alter ECK as well. So just like nodes, it's, do you want to be in the habit of changing those relationships? And they're creating plugins, actually, that are wonderful. So assuming you're on this side of things, we've created a new entity. It's made some decisions on how that's stored, where the routes are. I'd like to add some bundles. Actually, you have to here. So I'm going to create 2 different ones. One's called a one-liner. And now I have, analogous to a content type, I have a joke type. And let's add a second one, and it's going to be the knock-knock. From here, this is going to be very familiar. We created an entity, we created bundles, which is similar to creating a content type. We can add fields, manage their displays, manage their forms. This is similar to anything else you've done in the Drupal field and content management APIs. So I'm going to jump into code, because that's what I think this audience is all about. Let's check that out. Zoom in a little. And for Drupal console, if you're unfamiliar with it, it is a command line tool that has taught me so much about Drupal 8 because of the number of commands it has available for debugging and generating content. So in this case, if you have Drupal console natively installed, you'll use the command Drupal generate entity content, separate from generate entity config. You can do that through this tool as well. I have Lando prefix because I'm using that for my local development environment. And I need to put it in a module. I think I created a module already called Weather Tools. The new class, I'm going to call it Weather Entity. Machine name, I'll accept. I'll just take the defaults on most of these things. Will this entity have bundles? I'm going to say no for the use of us to be able to mentally digest this. So one weather item, this was my example of capturing time and temperature recordings routinely, is the only thing we'll be able to store. There's not different types of weather recordings. There's just one type. So similar to users, no bundles. Is it translatable? Not for me. Revisionable? I don't care for this example. Do you want this to have forms? Sure. It will have an owner. It's going through some of those base fields, and it's generated an API, or it's generated a number of features using the Entity API, using views integrations, using form integrations. In most cases, extending core technologies, or in a few cases, just creating general boilerplate for you to start your custom entity work. So we'll take a look at a lot of these. It's nice to see that 15 files got created. If I were to add this with bundles, if I were to turn on revisions, you will see that this list may increase, and certainly the content within these will increase as well. So feel free to explore all the features of the Drupal entity creation. It is a fun way to learn, and it's actually how I learned a lot of the Drupal entity API stuff, by going through what you just saw and just changing one value and seeing what changed in the code generation. Looking at the code, I hope that I hope the fonts are big enough. I don't know a way to increase font on presentation mode, but this is being recorded. So this is the weather entity that we just created. Oh, nope, node. So in our web modules custom weather tools, under source, entity is where we'll find all of our entity data. The entity itself and the interface that's behind it are available. The entity itself is what we'll look at. And if you're familiar with creating custom Drupal plugins, you're probably used to this annotation style where the properties of the item that you're defining appear as a comment above the class itself. Custom entities are a little different in that their annotation comes through as this sort of array object. Some of them look a little different depending on which plugins you're looking at, but similar concept. There are parts of the site that will crawl this annotation to figure out how to interact with the custom entity. Looking through some of the properties defined, it has an ID, it has a name, it has forms. Now, this is interesting where I said it will create some defaults for you. So this has an add form, an edit form, a delete form. Actually, some of these are using the same forms. This is our opportunity to change it. If we want to have a different edit form from an add form, we could either specify a new one here, or we could specify an existing form. We'll take a look at these before it's done. There's also a default. If any module is trying to access a form and wasn't in one of the specified keys, where is that going to default back to? These are standardized keys, and I suggest looking at some of the custom entities and documentation on D.O. Another example is delete multiple, so that's another form that you can create. Another spot of interest is the route providers. We'll look at this one too. These are the different places a user may go to interact with different parts of the entity. There are some of these that actually do a lot more than you might think. Translatable as true or false. Actually, I generally set it to true just so I have that support in the future. Base table, entity keys. These are all about the storage of the entity. It may seem redundant in some spaces, but label is actually one that I learned a lot from over the years, where a node type has a title and a user type has a name. So that type of mapping appears here in this entity keys, so we can use common language to access the properties of how this data is stored. Links is another fun one. This is a representation of how we access the entity in different contexts. These also follow a standardized naming convention, and there are quite a few that you can use. The canonical is what happens when we're looking at an entity. So in this case, to see an instance of whether content, we'd have to go admin structure, whether entity, and then the ID. This is similar to node/node ID. Edit would be the node/node ID/edit. This is our version. If we would like to change these URLs, we can do it here in the entity. So this is an opportunity to define those paths. In this case, I would leave this admin structure here if this was just internal. But if this was supposed to be external data, I can have some fun with it. And also, you can still use custom and contrib modules like path auto to create a friendly URL as well. In fact, I want to just quick show off the node before diving into those other interfaces, the node example, because this is probably very familiar with this audience, where it's called a node. A lot of these labels seem redundant, but they are used in different contexts throughout the Drupal interface. So when it's just one, you call it content. When it's multiple, you call it content items. The storage pieces, and actually it's a fun one to look at because it's not that interesting. Node access control handler. Is just going to show some very simple permissions. This is the type of thing that you can extend on your custom entity and either delete the rules you don't want, improve upon them, or start from scratch. But a method like access is going to check existing permissions. Does the user have the permission to bypass node access? If so, they're allowed to see this thing. Do they have the permission to access content? Do they have the permission to, oh, and then check the parents because the entity API might have its own. If you were creating your custom data using nodes, you would end up overriding a lot of this logic. At least now with our weather interface, we have a blank space to either use what Drupal console gave us out of the box or delete these and start from scratch with our own. So in this case, we have two: check access, which is for everything except for creating content, and check create access. The other ones that are interesting, route provider. Might actually seem pretty boring by default. The collection is the list of content. So I want to see all of my entities that node or that content overview page. It's that similar example, but for this custom entity. But traversing the parents, when looking at the route provider, we can see that there are other ones that we just get out of the box if we want to use the parent definition. So our custom entity would have an add page, an add form, a canonical route, an edit form, a delete form. It's up to you if you want to use all of those features or not. If my custom entity doesn't need those features, we can just delete it. And last one to show off. We did that one, we did that one. Oh, tasks and permissions. These are the tabs that occur on the entity forms or the links that appear in the main menu. So when viewing an entity, there is a settings link, there is an add link, an edit link, and permissions that also come out of the box. Once again, it is up to you to use these or not. Drupal console is just giving you some boilerplate to get started. So it's a fun tool to learn how to create custom entities. There's almost nothing you need to keep out of the files it generates outside of the entity itself, and you can decide how many of these pieces you want to customize as you go. And so actually with that, are there any questions?
Is the session recorded?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Is the session recorded?
Yes, it is. Session's recorded and the slides are online. Yes, sir.
What's the difference between task and action?
I always get these messed up in my head. That's down here, correct?
Yeah.
Let's take a peek. So I believe that the action One of them is this button here, and the other is when you're viewing an entity, and those links maybe appear above the content of your theme. Add, edit, view. So I always have to cheat and look them up. Oop, I lost. Oh, there it is. I always have to cheat and look them up, but I believe that this is the add entity that appears on the add form versus the tasks, which appear while you're viewing the entity itself. So one's an admin button, the other is where you would show your entity. Don't know if that was helpful.
How do you modify that, if you go back to the screen where you have entities? So this manage fields and like other menu items in this list, how do you add items to that list?
Sure. Well, in this case, this is in our custom entity, which I could enable. Let's just do that real quick. That way we can see some of these changes, hopefully. Oh, no. I think I started editing things in these screens.
You deleted the collection line.
All right, well, I will show you examples otherwise. So, let's look at nodes because they're so familiar. This form right here is the one that shows you all of the existing nodes. For our custom entity, we are going to see that in this list builder. So this is what you get out of the box with Drupal console, is going to have a build row method that you can customize to your heart's content. In this case, every row has a name and an ID, and then anything the parent row is building. In this case, the parent row has operations data in this method build operations. This is that list, that drop-down list that appears to the right in the case of the entity overview form. So if we want, we can, oops. If we want, we can alter this, or we can put our own custom logic in here before returning this. Sorry, I'm having a hard time programming and looking at everyone. So this is our opportunity to customize anything we want in those rows. So in the case of a listing of content, we have full control over what is returned right here. And when you look at the row element in the operations index, you'll see that there's a list of links. You can add your own, change the labels, things of that nature. Hope that pointed you in the right direction. Any other questions? Yes?
Just a comment about the sessions that you had there. So we here at Drupal worked on the site, made a program module. So it's called program, and it does what you're talking about there. Because we ran into the same issue that sessions, keynotes, etc. They're all basically the same thing. So instead of creating them as content types and nodes, there's now a contrib module called program that does that. And we're certainly looking for people who want to contribute. So if you guys are doing something, it'd be fun to look at.
I'm going to say that in the mic so everyone who watches this online can volunteer.
Yep.
But the conference schedule for Drupal GovCon has a program module that has a similar structure where you are creating reuse through this custom logic. And you would love some support for next year's conference to make it even more successful. That's cool to hear. One of the other things I had learned the hard way when creating conference websites was I was altering a lot of the forms for things like session data. And then all of that extra logic was useless on, say, the handful of pages that the website actually used. So it was a lot of just bloat or constantly checking form IDs. Am I on the node session form versus the node web forms form? And it was unnecessary bloat to load all the time. Any questions on entities? Yes?
So the ECK module and the Drupal console, are those performing similar functions, or what's the distinction?
Sure. The ECK module is a great way to build custom entities on autopilot. if you just use the WYSIWYG, the UI, you can create custom entities with a click of a button, but you're not going to, by default, get to build them from the ground up. It is going to be built off of the logic in the ECK module. You can alter that, but that's the same problem if you use nodes in the first place. So there are reasons you might want to alter the behaviors of your ECK entities, and they are actually evolving a lot of tools to help you do that. But for the most part, ECK, you're getting a structure that somebody else decided was a good basis for custom entities. I use that when I want to silo content to different parts of the site, but I don't want to invest all of the time to manage custom code. The Drupal console version, which we generated with this code, this is starter code. This is boilerplate. There are no updates to this code. You are responsible for maintaining it, where on ECK, that module will update over time, and some of the new features will get integrated into your custom code. Here, you have the technical debt or empowerment, depending on how you want to look at it. Very different implementations of custom entities. Anything else? Well, thank you so much for attending. This was a lot of fun. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to keep this conversation going. I nerd out on this stuff.